Hi everyone, I'm Christine Wamsler, Professor of Sustainability Science at Lund University in Sweden and Director of the Contemplative Sustainable Futures Program. In my capacity as head of the Sustainability and Climate Cluster of the Global Compassion Coalition, I have the honor to moderate today's session on the role of compassion in the climate crisis. More specifically, we will delve into how we can create the conditions for nurturing the mindsets and capacities needed to tackle the climate crisis, the role that compassion plays in this context, and what this would demand from this year's UN Climate Summit, which will take place in Dubai from November 30th until December 12th. You can find in the chat the structure of today's session, as well as the questions we will discuss during the next 60 minutes. I have invited 6 wonderful guests who will provide their perspectives on these questions based on their own work in this field. But before I introduce our guests and begin our discussion, I would like to invite Gustav to take the floor. He will do a short grounding meditation to help us let all of our personas and masks drop away to come back to our true selves and create the ground for connection and meaningful engagement for the better good. Gustav, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everyone. In the name of the topic for today, let's spend a few minutes just having some compassion for ourselves and tuning into our own systems. So I'll invite you to join me in finding a comfortable position. And if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes. Otherwise, I recommend just defocusing your gaze and looking away from the screen. And let's start out by just taking a few deep inhalations and exhalations. Most of the time, we spend most of our awareness and energy outside of ourselves. But now we just have a few minutes where we can give ourselves the gift of bringing our attention into ourselves and noticing what's moving in us as we enter this space today. Noticing how your breath is. Is it deep or is it shallow? Noticing your body and the weight against the chair or however you're seated. Noticing what's going on in your emotional landscape coming into this space. And see if you can notice without judgment, just paying attention and learning a little bit more about what's going on in your inner landscape right now. And in the last minute, I'll invite you, if it feels okay, to notice the space around your heart. And just know that everyone else on this stream and in this call is doing the same thing all across the globe. And gradually getting ready to let go of this practice. If you had your eyes closed, you can open them and come back into this virtual space. Maybe you want to do a little movement. Thank you all for practicing.
Thank you, Gustav. Wonderful. Thanks for the wonderful start. Let me now briefly introduce our wonderful guests, and later during the presentations, We will also add links in the chat where you can find more information about their work. So we have with us today Jamie Bristow, who, while director of the Mindfulness Initiative, co-authored the Reconnection Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out report, and now works as the policy lead for the Inner Development Goals Initiative. We also have with us Sharon Jans, co-founder and co-director of the Inner Green Deal, a non-profit initiative focused on inner development to accelerate the achievement of climate and sustainable development goals. And Sharon has recently co-authored a white paper on the human dimension of the Green Deal. I'm also happy to introduce Lynn Reeder, who is a member of the board of directors of the Global Compassion Coalition, the national lead of the Australian Compassion Council, the global coordinator of the science and research sector of the International Charter for Compassion, and a member of the Australian Women's Climate Congress. I also extend a warm welcome to Sister Shanti, additional head of the Brahma Kumaris, a spiritual non-governmental organization that has general consultative status at the UN and is an observer organization to the international climate conferences. Sister Shanti has been the organization's representative to the UN Geneva since 1982, and she brings spiritual principles to sustainability-related discussions worldwide. And finally, I welcome Peter Senge and Gustav Böll from the Center for Systems Awareness, an organization that focuses on advancing a compassionate systems approach to shaping the future of education. Peter is the co-founder of the center, and Gustav is assistant director of the Center's youth leadership work. Okay, so let's start the conversation with this wonderful group of people. And to respect each other's time, Alex from the Global Compassion Coalition will help us stay on track and remind us when we go over time. So you might see a red banner from time to time. So, Jamie, please be so kind and start and share with us your reflections based on the Reconnection report and your work with the IDGs. The floor is yours, Jamie.
So Christine, the context that we're having this conversation in is that most large-scale climate action to date has focused upon technical solutions to physical problems. But as we know, in the Anthropocene, where the Earth is now profoundly shaped by human forces, not only are humans dependent on climate systems, but the climate is dependent on our human systems. And human systems are not most fundamentally made up of like roads and power lines. They're made up, of course, of humans. Humans with evolved but hugely malleable cultures, cognitions, emotions, biases, and relationships. Excuse me. Taking this view, focusing on the human systems, we see that climate and the other 5 planetary boundaries that are now being crossed are symptoms of something deeper. They are symptoms of a crisis in human relationship. And this relationship crisis is characterized most fundamentally by disconnection. Disconnection from nature, disconnection from each other, underpinned by a disconnection from ourselves. Connection, on the other hand, has always been a cornerstone of human success over eons. We're the most collaborative mammals on the planet. Connection is also a core ingredient of human flourishing in our current time, wherever it's found, and it will likely be a key to our future survival. Connection inescapable, of course. We have no option but to be living completely independently in the world, embedded. What's missing is recognition of this fact, a mindset of conscious connection, seeing and feeling connection. Environmental destruction is literally senseless because it reflects our collective failure to feel the harm that we create. It's driven by a failure to acknowledge the wholeness of our world and to act as if we're part of it. So the inequalities that serve this conscious connection are unfortunately, over the last centuries, deprioritized, underdeveloped, and neglected. Thankfully, voices in the sustainability field, Christine amongst them, One neglect of these factors leaves existing theories of change wanting, and attention is increasingly turning to how these qualities of heart and mind can be better understood, developed, and applied. So I'm sure you can already see what the role of compassion could be in this context. Compassion, of course, is an inner motivational system that combines the capacity to connect with others and feel moved by their suffering with a drive to relieve that suffering. It is perhaps the pinnacle of conscious connection. So Christine and I spent a couple of years researching and writing a policy report that she mentioned in the introduction called Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, in which we explore the role of mindfulness and compassion in strengthening the cognitive and emotional foundations of connection. We challenge the belief that compassion is some kind of soft nice to have, but frame it instead as a foundational capacity that is essential for us to stay with the trouble as things inevitably get tough. At one point, we quote Tom Rivett-Carnac, a well-known author and climate lobbyist, when he said that compassion has an enormously practical application in the world. It is an entry point to action on all types of social and environmental issues. So what needs to be achieved at COP to support this? Well, at the moment, COP and the UN are not culturally equipped to consider inner change. It is starting to appear in UN reports. The last IPCC reports mentioned phrases like inner transitions towards sustainability for the first time, but it's not on the radar of the policymakers and politicians in the UN. One of the things that is beginning to address this, however, is the Inner Development Goals Initiative, which I contribute to. At its core is an open source framework codifying 23 inner skills, qualities, and capabilities into 5 domains of being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. Of course, compassion is an important part of the relating domain. This framework provides the lexicon for considering the importance of the inner and to help it find its place at the table. So that's, I guess, what can be done is that we can find a way that these skills and qualities like compassion can find their place in the discourse, and create policy recommendations about how they can be developed. All right, thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Jamie. It has been a pleasure to work with you on the Reconnection report. I would now like to ask Sharon to add to the discussion with his perspectives based on his leadership work and the recent policy report on the human dimension of the Green Deal. The floor is yours, Sharon.
Thank you, Christine. It's wonderful to be here. Well, and just to pick up and continue the discussion, Jamie just outlined why it's important to reconnect as humans and why we need to cultivate these transformative human capacities. And with the Inner Green Deal, we offer programs to exactly do this. And more specifically, we offer climate leadership, resilience, and mindfulness programs to policymakers and decision makers at the European institutions, the United Nations, and also to community leaders from around the world. And over the past years, with our partner organization Envirus, we have reached over 2,000 policymakers within the European institutions alone. And these programs are mostly online and range in length from 1-hour introduction sessions to a full journey of, say, 6 modules of 2.5 hours. But we also increasingly bring people outside and offer one-day programs in forest, which people feel are very transformative. And then throughout these programs, I would like to say that there's one thing we do that enables this transformation to happen, but that would not really do justice to the complexity of the challenge. And based on our research on inner-outer transformation, on behavior change, on mindfulness and compassion, as well as our own experience, we find that we need to become better at a number of specific abilities that together could be seen as foundational to accelerate the green and just transformation. And Jamie already mentioned the inner development model. We work with this model, and it has these 5 elements: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. And we cultivate qualities alongside these or within these categories. And examples include long-term thinking, systems thinking, empathy, compassion, appreciation, and noticing the positive, but also concrete communication and mobilizing skills. So that gives you a little bit of a sense. And then what's the role of compassion in this context? Well, if I had to pick one quality that we feel is particularly important, it would be compassion, which is at the heart of our programs and which we really see as a bridge towards others, and also a bridge towards stronger relationships and towards stronger collaboration. And as you know, compassion is an innate quality that we all have, but it's not something that is typically discussed in a policy context. And clarifying what compassion is and what it isn't is important. And people often find that helpful to, for instance, understand the difference between empathy and compassion, and why, for instance, self-compassion is not about indulgence, but is really an essential enabler to integrate this into our own lives, and also really helpful for policymakers. So this is what we try to do. We help policymakers practice compassion, integrate it in their work. And not only during the sessions, the programs that we offer, but we also invite them to practice in their own time through, for Bring Them in Nature, through supported by mobile applications. We invite them to practice and consider the perspective of others, others that are close to them, but also, for instance, wildlife, and how, for instance, climate change impacts the lives of others. And, compassion is particularly relevant at this time, we feel, at the time when climate regulations need to be implemented and also start to bite, if you will. And there are legitimate concerns about affordability and climate justice. And to meet these concerns, policymakers need to listen and have compassion for those who struggle with this transformation and help to mobilize resources for a just transition. Now, each program is, of course, a bit different, and we continue to adjust and learn from our program evaluations. And for that, we work together with Christine Wamsler, who's here, of course, who evaluates our programs. And one of our key conclusions is that the outline process helps participants to become more rooted, more aware, and more connected to nature, of which we are, of course, part of. But also more connected to others, overcoming polarization, and being also more connected to ourselves and what is important to us. And from this sense of connection, come to a sense of responsibility and agency, the feeling that what I do matters. And this is very important, and a contrast to how people sometimes enter our programs with a sense of fatigue and overwhelm. And the basis for that transformation is activating these human capacities that we all have, but sometimes have neglected. Now, maybe just a few words on COP. We wrote together with Professor Wamsler a paper on the human dimension of the Green Deal, how to overcome polarization, facilitate culture and systemic change. And we described there the root causes. And based on that, we call on leaders to, first of all, explicitly acknowledge these root causes of the poly crisis, that what Jamie described is this disconnect from nature, others, and ourselves, and to cultivate capacities such as compassion to reconnect. We also support the development of more inclusive learning and collaboration communities. And I'll just to shorten it, agree on concrete measures to enable a just transformation, measures that are informed by compassion and make a concrete difference on the ground. In COP terms, we need to agree on the adequate loss and damage funding, probably, to enable a just transformation. And we need to integrate these human dimension and qualities, such as compassion, in all of our environmental and climate actions. So with that, I would pause and curious what the next speaker will have.
Thank you, Jerome. And thank you for linking compassion to other transformative qualities and capacities that are needed to address the climate crisis. Now I would like to invite Lynn to take the floor. Lynn has also worked with policymakers on compassion and climate change. The floor is yours, Lynn.
Good. Thank you, Christine. Thank you. I suppose here in Australia, I'll just take you through some of the things that we've been doing in bringing compassion into climate change policy. One of the things that we've done is, so the Charter for Compassion has been working with the Women's Climate Congress here, and the Women's Climate Congress has developed a Charter for Change, and Action 6 of that charter is to elevate compassion and kindness in government. And so to date, we've held several activities related to that, and they include face-to-face workshop where we were progressing the actions of the WCC Charter for Change. These actions include policies such as the introduction of legislation for the protection of future generations, pretty much along the lines of the Welsh Government's model. Organised an online webinar with yourself and Jamie Bristow to promote the important report that you've done on reconnection, meeting the climate crisis inside out. And for that, the good thing about that is that we're bringing policymakers and people from managers in NGOs together to really start to put this on their agenda as well. And then by specific policy briefings. So in my role as the national lead for the Australian Compassion Council, currently offering Australian parliamentarians briefings to explore the contribution of compassion science to climate change, with recommendations from both the WCC Charter and the Reconnection Report for those tangible policy outcomes. For example, one from the Reconnection Report is to create specialised units and/or positions for mainstreaming inner dimensions within climate change departments. So this political briefing that I do also ask people to realise that this is not, really new. It's new in some stage, in some aspects, but I know that climate scientists here in Australia have recognised a long time ago that facts alone weren't engaging parliamentarians in the seriousness of climate change. So, and even interestingly today, in the Australian Guardian, there was an article from one of those leading scientists, Professor Graham Pearman, who I know personally, and who I know that decades ago was bringing in psychologists to try and work out how he could influence parliamentarians when facts alone weren't shifting them. So, and Graham Pearman in that article said, "It is us as humans who have preferenced the value of wealth creation over and above caring values that we might have for each other, our earth and fellow species." And one of the things you asked us to consider, Christine, was how do we create the conditions for these nurturing mindsets? So I've got 3 suggestions for that. So one is by systematically investigating what motivates humans to care for one another. Secondly, by gathering evidence on the incentives that encourage compassionate action as they relate to climate change policy. And then thirdly, as an academic, very aware of the importance of knowledge transfer. So I think through knowledge transfer activities of compassion research, the research that's examining how human motivations guide our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours, because it is these studies that are providing clearer insights into how we can improve our capacity to see and respond to the suffering caused by climate change. And then what does this mean for the work at COP? So I feel 2 things there. One, an agreement, serious agreement, that requires governments to take seriously their need to develop expertise in mainstreaming inner dimensions such as compassion into policy making, and by insisting that policymakers deeply understand that now is the time to move from a scenario where the only lesson learned in climate change policy is that evolution has led our behaviour and individual behaviour and societal institutions in directions that are unsustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for building on Jamie's and Jerome's presentations. Thank you so much. Sister Shanti, would you please also be so kind and share with us your reflections, and particularly from the perspective of your work with the UN and other stakeholders? The floor is yours, Sister Shanti.
Thank you, Christine, for bringing us all together for this very important occasion. And firstly, I'd say that the mindset that's missing, because we become so disconnected with each other, and yes, it's a word that's come up frequently in the last several minutes. I'd say that the mindset really has to come back to the awareness of being one human family and be able to support each other so that we're able to move together and bring in whatever is needed to help reverse the impact of climate change. And what we found is that the other thing that's very much, of course, connected is the whole subject of the role of faith leaders at the UN. And in 2015, we had the opportunity of several conversations with Christiana Figueres. And what happened through that is that she commented that she was now seeing how bringing together faith leaders could make a huge difference. And so this is exactly what she did. She brought together all the major traditions, and it led to a summit of the faith leaders in 2015 in New York. And within that, we could see how if we were to come together and pool our resources, it would have a huge, huge impact on the grassroots level, but also it would impact the leadership. The other thing that we found was that in 2017, UNESCO actually issued a whole set of ethical principles, which included compassion, that could help in climate change negotiations. And that was such an important step forward, because compassion is at the heart of all the spiritual traditions. And of course, we've been highlighting how compassion helps. But what we also found was that if there is that awareness of compassion, then our attitude and the interconnectedness with not just all human beings and nature generally, but also with all living creatures really is enhanced through compassion. And when that happens, then a very, very simple change that people can make in their day-to-day life is, of course, veganism and being totally plant-based in terms of our food and drink is the most important factor. But in fact, just reducing our intake of red meat, for example. It's very interesting that just today in the Guardian in the UK, they highlighted a couple of things from the IPCC report, the latest one. And what they said was that yes, things seem to be going in the wrong direction. Things are warming up rather than coming back to the temperature we would like to have, which is 1.5 above the industrialization temperature. But what's actually happening, we're going in the reverse direction. And in order to be able to cut down emissions, the first and foremost would, of course, be going back to solar and wind systems for generation of power and energy. And the Brahma Kumaris have played a leading role in that in India in particular since the 1980s, in fact. And what's happened there is that India One became the system that was able to introduce solar thermal power to be able to provide electricity for our township of 25,000. But it's become a model for many, many others to also follow. And so that's one thing. But the other thing that every human being can do that again would reduce huge emissions And all of this is without cost, in a sense, so nothing expensive or anything, but rather simplifying our needs and coming back to plant-based diet. And if we support each other in this, then definitely there can be many ways found to make plant-based diet very exciting and interesting for people, and not just dull and boring and a burden. And so compassion is being highlighted in terms of making sure that there is that dignity preserved. And in terms of COP, yes, it's not very conducive for deep, heart, soul searching questions. But what I'd suggest is that there are always individuals who are interested in looking at the deeper significance of matters. And if there could be spaces where this could be encouraged, where there could be dialogue on a heart-to-heart basis, that could be very conducive in carrying things forward and making things move, because leaders and activists will always be interested in that sort of deep exchange. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Shanti. And thank you for all the important work you're doing. And finally, now I would like to ask you, Peter, to share with us your reflections based on the work of the Center for Systems Awareness. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Well, I always appreciate being able to come at the end of a session like this, because just to take in all the good work that people are doing and to recognize that it is a real sign of the times that all the people in the world, the hundreds of millions illustrated by our small group, are in fact in the business of creating something very new now. I mean, there's a couple of simple thoughts that kept coming back as I was listening. First off is, we have this very kind of dual challenge right now. We're trying to keep the sink from shipping while we're trying to rebuild the ship. The ship, of course, I'm referring to is the industrial age, materialistic, consumer culture. We all know it. I have no point in elaborating. But it's brought great benefits to a lot of people. It's also brought great suffering. And it's so out of line, not only with nature, but with how humans have lived when we've lived well. We know what it means to live well. We have many, many societies in the world. By numbers, they're small in terms of population, but by numbers in terms of societal experiments, they're really quite large, who have lived for thousands of years. I recently visited a nation within Canada that's possible in the Canadian Constitution to recover sovereignty. It's a long legal process, but it has now been done by a few of the Indigenous nations. And they've been basically living in a valley in the north of British Columbia for 10,000 years. And when you're around a society like that, you realize that this is not complicated. We do know how to do this. The problem is, in a way, the whole industrial age, and you might really say the industrial age, building on a lot of cultural developments in the last 2,000 years, have basically headed humanity in the opposite direction. So this ship is sinking. This is an era of collapse. Collapse is not a bad thing. When ecosystems get out of balance, or a nested ecosystem within a larger natural environment get out of balance, they eventually can't thrive. They compete with one another. They kind of create conditions where everything is focused internally rather than on balance and harmony with the larger system you're part of, and they collapse. So we have two basic challenges. Somehow during this collapse, so many of our instincts make things worse, not better. Fear, anger, polarization, we see it all around us. There's no need to elaborate it. Those are our instinctual reactions to the fear of collapse and losing what we have. So somehow we have to temper those. They're not going to go away. They're just part of a human condition. The problem is not that they exist. The problem is that they dominate. The second, of course, is to keep our minds focused on what we're trying to build. We do know how to live differently. Something very different can emerge out of this collapse. It will take the century. Climate change is a very useful barometer or measuring stick, if you will, because in a sense it's very simple. It's one of the most simple universal indicators of the out of balance condition of the way we live. It also tells us that this is the journey of the century, if not longer. This is not a 5-year problem or a year problem. It's a problem of the 21st century. It's been a problem of the 20th century and now the 21st century. Therefore, the leaders of this, most of them are not born. The leaders of this change are coming. The leaders of this change are the children. The leaders of this change are the young people. That brings us face to face with a core dilemma that we've heard again and again. How, when we're dealing with such deep cultural changes, what's the role and how do we make best use of the role of our existing apparatus of governance and formal leadership, like the UN, like our nation state system? These systems themselves, certainly the nation state system, in my mind, are symptoms of the imbalance, the fragmentation, the disconnection, as we've heard many times. I am an American. You are you understand. But that's the apparatus we have. So events like the COP Summit are simply an event in this journey of how do we make some use of that apparatus in dealing with problems for which that apparatus was never designed. It's not fit, it's not capable. So as Sister Jayanti said at the very end, it starts with finding the people and connecting with the people who are in that system who can understand. Second is to appreciate, and they really can't do very much. They can probably slow the sinking of the ship, but most of the acceleration of the sinking is us, our fear, anxiety, and reactions to the problems. In the end, how do we build this new ship, and what is the role of that apparatus? My personal feeling is it's limited, but it's not trivial. So that's a question we all hold here. You know, we are live in an age which to me is defined by facing very fundamental problems for which our leadership systems and formal institutional mechanisms are simply not adequate. We should start by telling the truth about that and not pretending the real show is not over here. The real show is over here. It's here. It's here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your important work and insights that you have brought to the discussion and how you have linked that to the previous presentations. Thank you for that. Before I open up the discussion to questions from the audience, I would like to invite the panel members to reflect on where they see synergies between their presentations and work in the field. So we have already started with that a bit. And I would like to invite now Gustav to start the conversation about this question on synergies. And please, Gustav, also add your perspectives from the youth-related work at the Center for Systems Awareness. Gustav, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your inspiring presentations and talks. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the importance of youth leadership when it comes to the climate crisis and the role of compassion. I've been working with youth leaders from more than 100 different countries, teaching the compassionate systems framework, which aims at exactly what Jamie shared in the beginning, both the understanding of connection via the system's dynamics, but also the experience of connection via cultivating compassion. So firstly, it's the compassionate thing to do to teach the youth and everyone else what they need to learn in order to deal with the crisis of their lifetime. And in order to do this in a way that is compassionate, it needs to be realized and recognized that when we teach young people and everyone in general, but especially young people, about climate crisis and how the world is not in a very good place, it is, if that information is being put through in a way that is actually going to change these youth in how they see the world, it is a deeply existential experience, because the climate crisis is getting worse and worse, and we are reaching critical tipping points. So how do we teach this in a way that is compassionate? And we do this by recognizing the emotions and giving a safe space where it's okay to have emotional responses to what you learned, but also teaching practices of emotional self-regulations, such as the mindfulness practices. And then also importantly, realizing that compassion is not just something to understand. Compassion is something that both from experience, but also from all the sciences of psychology and neurology and so on, is something we can practice and cultivate. So actually practicing compassion is also a part of this. We need the youth voice and the youth leaders in this crisis more than I think we realize at times. It's very obvious when we look at the global movements around youth leadership and activism when it comes to climate crisis, that youth for some reason are more connected to this crisis than all other demographics. And it's very obvious why that is. Maybe it's not all obvious, but some of it is that this is their future. They're going to live their whole life with the climate crisis. And so we need to not just teach them about it and say, figure this out, but we need to give them the tools and capacities that they need in order to deal with these problems together in the future that they are going to live in. And one of the important ways to do that is to acknowledge that when we learn about the system's dynamics and the science of climate, we also need compassion for ourselves, for each other in our learning communities. And then obviously it is also compassion for the world and for the planet that is going to ultimately drive the change processes that we want to see in the future. So thank you for allowing the youth perspective in here. And I'll just open up for other panel members to talk about what synergies they thought of and felt when we heard from the others.
Thank you, Gustav. Yeah, so thank you, Alex, for bringing us all on the screen. So I guess also when I was listening to you, the things that came up repeatedly were like the need for creating a changing consciousness, the need for developing transformative capacities, and also the importance for transformative spaces. Several of you mentioned that in different contexts, like Sharon referred to that when working with policymakers, leadership courses. And then in the context of education, obviously. And I just wanted to mention in that context that just thinking about these transformative spaces, obviously also here, as you mentioned, compassion is absolutely vital as a method, at the focus of inquiry, and as a guiding principle or value for such spaces. So all the things that you have brought up before. And there are actually such transformative spaces, for instance, by the Research Institute for Sustainability, called Co-Creative Reflection Dialogue Spaces, as some of you were involved in giving presentations for these spaces. So just wanted to point towards the importance of these transformative spaces and having them at these different levels in the context of education, in the context of leadership courses, and also in the context of the COP, for instance. Could I invite others if they have seen other synergies or perhaps differences that they would like to highlight or want to build on?
I think Sister Janti was raising her hand, I think.
Sister Shanti.
I'd like to focus a little bit on the spiritual perspective, because when we see each other, Peter referred to the American or the Indian and whatever, but to change this, the tool for this is to really go inside and know that the living being, the energy that I am, the being that I am, is actually the same as in everyone else. We've talked about interconnectedness, but it is this inner being which is connected with not just every single human being, but recognizes also the value of every single creature and each species on this planet, and recognize the sanctity of that. And so I think that it's so important to bring in that bigger picture. On the one side, it's going inside, but yet going inside is helping us break all the boundaries that exist outside, so that then truly there is that vision of oneness and wholeness in which we're connected with each other in a very deep way. We share the same values, we share the same principles, we have the same color blood, no matter what the color of our skin may be, the color of our sweat and tears is the same. And so understanding this oneness, I think, and young people can adapt to that awareness very, very quickly if they're given even a little bit of guidance in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Gustav.
Thank you for bringing that in, Sister Shanti. And I agree. You know, it is very natural for people. I think actually it's something that we grow out of. So when we get to work with children and youth early on, and teach them practices to cultivate compassion and understanding global issues, we see that it is extremely inherent. And when we think about something like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? That is a vision that the UN has created, and all the countries has agreed that, you know, we want to work on this global vision. But we have all the knowledge to do it. What we don't have is that inner sustainability that I hear you talking about that's going to fuel the change for outer sustainability. So that connection is so vital and really critical. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just, perhaps we can just hold a moment, both Jamie and Sharon, and perhaps we can also bring in questions from the audience, and perhaps I can just collect some of the questions, and then we can just bring them into the discussion of synergies and what is needed. Alex and Rachel, if you can help me to send the questions so that I can see them, and then I can read some of them. One person is asking about what would you call this work or this movement? I guess that the person refers to the work that we are doing, and the person says in a way that it can connect with people ever more widely in simple language. Is it holistic change and holistic change facilitation? So I guess what is important about this question, or interesting about this question, is also that we are really struggling with terminology in that field. You mentioned a crisis of disconnection, others call it a meaning crisis, a crisis of separation, a crisis of an existential crisis. So there's a lot of terminology both for what we are facing and what we want to do about it. So I guess it's an interesting question. So how could we put things in simple wording to reach beyond our own bubble?
If I may, Christine, I think this also speaks to what I was hoping to reflect on in terms of the sort of themes between our different panelists, because we're in the process of filling in a completely missing domain of human experience when we in public discourse in a policy context, and that's a huge kind of like epoch shifting, huge cultural move. And I'm talking really about the modernist culture here that came from Enlightenment Europe, because obviously there's parts of the world where this domain hasn't been missing and still is alive and flourishing. And we're in the process of finding the language for this to land and be heard in different places. So the Reconnection Report is an attempt to do that in policy language. The Under Development Goals is language that kind of hooks onto the Sustainable Development Goals, and it works particularly well in UN contexts. And I'm really struck by what Sister Janti was saying there about faith, the role of faith, and we need to recognize that the majority of the world have a faith, have a strong faith. And I'd be really interested, like, where these little islands of coherence is a phrase I really like where all these different bits of language and terminology sort of meet each other, and how they can meet and sort of hand off to each other in a way. And I don't think there is a single word for what's going on here. But that it is really big and it's really profound, and therefore it's sort of so big it can't really get contained within a phrase or within a word. So I think that's a great question. But that thing about where does the inner development goals, which is quite kind of simplified framework so that it can travel across different cultures, meet the much richer and more ancient language of faith, and how do we have a dialogue between those, I think is a really interesting next phase, I guess.
Yeah. And I was going to say too that I think it depends on the audience in terms of the terminology. Certainly I've found in reaching out to parliamentarians here, they get inner development goals. Oh yeah, they can see how that links to the sustainable development goals. So that's really helpful. But then trying to sort of reach people who don't take a lot of interest in policy and really aren't interested in, I think too, if people aren't interested in doing any sort of self-reflection, it's very difficult. This is almost, not frightening, but worrying for them. They'd just rather not go there. So I think it just depends, a bit horses for courses, I think, in terms of language.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Peter wanted to add to that, if I understood you're nodding or not.
Oh, really not very much.
Sorry,
We just have to operate from the conviction that in some sense, well, as Jamie said, it's a missing domain in the narrative of modernity. It's not missing at all. Every human being understands this. If there was any kind of resonance with what Jayanti said about we really have to access the spirit and the spiritual aspects of our life, there's nothing idiosyncratic or unique to any culture about that. So I think it's more a story we've told ourselves that, we've gotten far away from that, but we're humans. We have a biological connection with life. We know life emerged in a vacuum on this planet or any place else as far as we know. And our spiritual traditions have simply been a way to culturally embed this fundamental of living. We live out of interconnectedness. We don't necessarily think that way because we have a body, we have an ego, we have all these things that tend to create the illusion of separateness. But you might say the universal dimension of all spiritual traditions is to kind of lessen the confusion and recognize, not idealistically, but factually, we are an expression of living interconnectedness, period. People.
Yeah, we are living the illusion of disconnection in a connected world, right? Yeah.
Maybe if I can just briefly come in and just to add to that, there's also a question in the chat about, yes, absolutely agree that we need youth leadership. And of course, we recognize that as well. And at the same time, I would say we need to take our responsibility too. We cannot just kind of hand this over like, this is your task, guys, good luck.
Yeah.
So I do feel that, as Peter was saying, these are inherent qualities. It'd be such a waste to discount current leadership by saying, well, they didn't understand it and they created this mess, so let's not believe in them. We work explicitly with leaders in current roles. And I've seen the most hard-nosed leaders who are sometimes perceived as tough and aggressive open up in wonderful ways, in surprising ways, and actually having the credibility then to follow through on their insights, because they carry this weight, they carry this power, they also carry the ability to bring people along. So I would think actually that, yes, we need to work with youth, we need the inspiration, the energy of the youth, and we need to not give up. We need to open up, we need to bring people in nature and invite them to be themselves, their true selves, to step into that and then own it up, take responsibility, not to save as heroes, what needs to be saved, just simply to integrate and to do what's needed to at least lessen the impact for the next generation.
Thank you for that comment, Jeroen. I just want to, briefly add to that is like, firstly, thank you for including the responsibility of the not youth. That is obviously essential. And secondly, like, just to sort of what you said, Peter, and you said, Sister Shanti and Jamie, the spiritual traditions have all been around compassion, and we all have this inherent capacity. But I think, to your point, Jeroen, it's just so important to also know that this is something that we can practice. And there is a lot of research and science saying that if we practice these skills, our behaviors will change. So just to say that in the spiritual traditions, the reason why it worked was because of the practice of prayer and meditation and these things. So just having the UN goals or the mental understanding won't get us there. We need to actively practice inner development and compassion.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask the final question because of the time, building on that. And the question is, how can leaders in various sectors such as business and politics infuse compassion into their decision-making processes to drive more sustainable outcomes? And I believe that the person who asked the question refers to what also Lynn referred to as mainstreaming or integrating compassion into existing systems and structures. So apart from what we have discussed on the education and the practicing part, we're looking into how can we actually build it into systems and structures. So I'm wondering if somebody could provide an answer for 1 minute, because then we have to move on. It's always brave enough to take that on.
Well, I think there is a lot of work happening at the moment in bringing compassion into business. Monica Warline, for example, there are a number of organisations that are specifically doing that work. Here in Australia, I've established a CEO group, and it's really about resourcing them. You have to bring them to the starting point for them to realise, wow, this is a whole other way of thinking about policy. And I think, especially after COVID, there's a lot of disruption within businesses. So I actually feel it's probably a good time now, because people get things like bringing psychological safety into organisations, and just the resources that you can bring with compassion science. We know Tanya Singer has done a huge amount of work in identifying practices, but then researching and showing that compassion training actually makes a difference to how people perform within organisations. So I think, just like we're doing here, bringing it all together is such an important contribution.
Thank you so much. And yeah, there's a lot to learn from how to integrate and mainstream new topics, new cross-cutting topics from other fields. So there's a lot of other sectors and fields to learn from, and to bring it to the aspect of the inner and compassion to support sustainability. So thank you. Unfortunately, we have only a few minutes left, and I would therefore like to invite Jamie to do a short closing meditation, just helping us to find stillness again and creating the ground for deep insights beyond words. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Do I still have 3 minutes, or should I make it shorter?
I think 2 is fine.
Let's find our posture. If you'd like to join this short practice, a posture that's relaxed, upright, alert, tuning into the full sense of the body as much as that's available to you. This feeling of just sitting here, breathing. In the context of the whole body, tuning into perhaps the heart center, where we left off with Gustav. And any sense of resonance, of feeling impacted by what's been heard. Closing the eyes and putting a hand on the heart center if that's helpful. Feeling this precious heart. Its capacity to be impacted, to be tender, to connect. And all the degrees of beauty, soulfulness, that capacity to be impacted can bring us. But it can also bring difficulty. The allowing ourselves to be open to the conditions in our world. So also bringing a tenderness and a care and a compassion for our heart, for our being that can be. That can feel so deeply. Then extending this care to those who are watching this stream, who are in this meeting together. Before opening the eyes if they've been closed. Coming back to this call together to finish our time.
Thank you, Jamie. And my deepest gratitude to all of the panel members for their time, work, and insights, and to the participants, of course. And today's event has marked the beginning of an ongoing conversation, exploration, action-taking on the role of compassion for sustainability and the work of our policy cluster on compassion, sustainability, and climate change. So I hope you enjoyed today's session and that you're filled with new ideas, inspiration, motivation, and hope for your own work and engagement in the field. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.